Just a reminder that this meeting is being broadcasted and recorded, so please make sure your cell phones are silenced and that you are using the microphone and making sure the light is green when you are speaking, so that everyone can hear you. To get started, I would like to ask Brooke to please take the roll call.
Chair Bullock,
Present.
Representatives Bellman,
Leave.
Boyd, Serrato,
Here.
Curry,
Leave.
Fleming,
Leave.
Genst, Hambidge, Howard,
Leave.
Kazim,
Leave.
Krajewski,
Leave.
McAndrew, Nelson,
Leave.
Powell,
Leave.
Chair Joswiak,
Here.
Representatives Fink,
Leave.
Flick,
Leave.
Hogan,
Leave.
Grimkrupa,
Leave.
Kutz,
Don't know.
McKenzie,
Leave.
Rossi,
Leave.
Schlegel,
Leave.
Watro, Zimmerman,
Thank you, Brooke, for taking the roll call. I'd like to thank everyone who has joined us today. Paul, to our guest, I want you to not take any personal response to our attendance today. Many of our members have voting meetings, but we do have this meeting recorded so that our members can return to this information hearing and get the information that you shared with us. But I welcome you to this hearing on behalf of our committee and as the majority chair of our committee. As you know, here in the United States, April is recognized as the National Child Abuse Prevention Month, a month that we use to recognize and raise awareness amongst our communities about the crucial role each of us play in preventing child abuse and neglect. During the whole month of April, programs across the country and here in the Commonwealth will focus on providing additional education and support to help increase and support the well-being of children and their families. According to the data from a 2022 Pennsylvania Department of Human Services report, mandated reporters disclosed close to 40,000 claims of suspected child abuse and neglect across the state. This is a 3% increase over the previous years. The purpose of today's meeting is to educate our members about the Children's Trust Fund and their role in preventing child abuse and neglect here in the Commonwealth. With that, please let me introduce today's guest, Mr. Paul DiLorenzo. Paul is the board chair with the Children's Trust Fund. He is also a national child welfare consultant and a senior fellow with the Child Welfare League of America. I've had the honor to work with Paul in the last few months as an appointee to the Children's Trust Fund, and I am honored to have him with us today. I ask that all of the members hold their questions until Mr. DiLorenzo has finished his remarks. And for the members participating virtually, please make sure that you are also using your microphones when you're speaking and that it is muted when you are not. If you would like to ask our guest a question, please use the hand-raising feature so that you may be acknowledged. With that said, before we give the floor to Mr. DiLorenzo, I would like to offer my co-chair an opportunity to share a few remarks, and then after he's finished, I would ask the members to just briefly introduce yourself and your district.
Thank you, Chairwoman Bullock. I just want to recognize Representative Malou has joined us. Thank you for scheduling today's informational meeting for the Pennsylvania Children's Trust Fund, which provides funding for community-based programs and services with a focus on prevention efforts. And according to the Department of Human Services, you already mentioned this, there was a little over 39,000 reports of suspected child abuse received in 2022. And clearly these numbers demonstrate the importance of child abuse prevention. It is my understanding that the Children's Trust Fund is undergoing a metamorphosis with some new additions to the board. These new members will approach the issues with a fresh eye so that this organization can utilize the dollars it receives to fund the most effective programs. So I look forward to hearing your testimony today, sir, and appreciate your time. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Members, if you could just briefly introduce yourself and your district, and we'll start with Representative Ballou.
I'm Representative Malou McKenzie
from the 131st District. I represent part of Northampton County, part of Lehigh County, and the top part of Montgomery County.
Good morning, I'm Nancy Gens. I take care of the 152nd District, which encompasses Upper Moreland, Lower Moreland, Granathan, Hatboro, and a section of Abington.
I'm Representative Melissa Serrato. I represent the 151st District in Montgomery County, encompassing Horsham Township, Upper Dublin Township, Ambler Borough, and Montgomery Township.
Good morning. Dane Watrow. I represent Southern Luzerne County and Northern Schuylkill County.
Thank you to the members and Representative McKenzie, and my apologies for referring to your first name. And to Paul, thank you for joining us today. You may begin your testimony. Excuse me, Paul, I apologize. Can you pull the microphone to you, make sure the green light is on? And then start over. I think we couldn't hear you on the...
Okay.
Thank you.
Well, good morning. My name is Paul DiLorenzo, and I'm the chairman of the Children's Trust Fund Board. In my full-time role, I serve as the executive director of the Salem Health and Wellness Foundation in New Jersey. I began my career in child welfare in 1976 as a caseworker in Philadelphia. I've also served in state government at the Pennsylvania Office of Children, Youth, and Families as a special assistant, and in Philadelphia as the director of children's policy. Prior to those roles, to my current role, I spent 13 years at Casey Family Programs and in various consulting roles around the country. I live in Montgomery County in Bala-Cynwyd. I'm excited to be here and humbled to be serving as the chair of the board that includes a number of very impressive individuals from all over the Commonwealth. Like myself, many of the board members are very recent appointees, and as such, we are using this as an opportunity to clarify our North Star. In a recent meeting that included most of the board members, we affirmed our commitment to supporting children, their families, and the communities in which they live. The best way to keep kids safe and thriving is to assure that their families have the right balance of parenting information, economic and healthcare services and resources, and supportive communities. So I want to use my time today to provide you with an overview of the Children's Trust Fund Board and how it has had an impact in Philadelphia and in Pennsylvania. Though the enabling legislation is somewhat dated, the trust fund's purpose is still relevant and necessary. I'm confident that the new board members will work to keep kids safe and families strong. But before we get into the slide presentation, I do want to thank the Center for Schools and Communities and our partners at the Pennsylvania Office of Child Development and Early Learning for their support to the Children's Trust Fund Board. It's been really a significant contribution of their time and expertise. So we're going to start the PowerPoint that I'm going to walk through with you. And this is a PowerPoint that we used at a recent planning retreat of the new board members. Let's go to the first slide. So the purpose of the Children's Trust Fund is to fund community-based programs and services for child abuse and neglect in Pennsylvania. And historically, this board has had has had a focus primarily on what we call primary and secondary abuse prevention programs. And for those of you who are not clear on that, primary prevention is community-wide education, really those kinds of programs that support families way upstream, right before anything happens, before there's even any suspicion or reports or allegations of abuse or neglect. And then secondary prevention when families do have some risk factors, but there's some opportunities to work with the family to make sure that kids remain safe and that the family remains intact. The trust fund has a pretty significant history rooted in some national work, not just here in Pennsylvania. The person who kind of got this going was Dr. Ray Helfer and some of you might know his name if you know anything about the history of child abuse and neglect and protective services resources in this country and the study of child abuse and neglect. It was Dr. Kemp and Dr. Helfer. And they together had a vision for creating a fund in each state that would provide opportunities for prevention, supporting families at an earlier stage so that serious maltreatment and serious neglect did not occur. Pennsylvania's trust fund was established in 1988. I'd like to just kind of put a plug into the fact that I was one of the advocates for that legislation and actually served on the first Children's Trust Fund board in 1988. So I'm old. I'll get that out of the way. It was a real honor to have not only advocated for that piece of legislation here in Pennsylvania, but also to have served on that first board. And it gave us an opportunity to kind of carve out the way we wanted to do work at that time. But Pennsylvania is now connected to a network of children's trust funds around the country. 1989, there was a national alliance of these trust funds that was established, and now just about every state in the country and D.C. and Puerto Rico have children's trust funds. The funds come from a variety of sources, and I just want to talk about that briefly, if we can. Go on to the next slide. So they take on a variety of forms, trust funds. Some are governmental, some are quasi-governmental, some are standalone as nonprofits, and some serve as adjuncts to nonprofits, and some are a combination. We're what you consider a quasi-governmental trust fund, and that seems to work well for Pennsylvania because, as you know, the trust fund board members are volunteers, don't do this full-time, but really do depend on the Department of Human Services, the Office of Child Development and Early Learning, and the Center for Schools and Communities as a way to keep the work moving forward, which is not insignificant. So this quasi-governmental status works nicely for us. Let's go on to the next slide. Now, people always ask the question, where does the money come from, right? Well, in Pennsylvania, it's a pretty unique and interesting resource for us and kind of a constant source of money. But if you look at nationally, look across the country, different trust funds do this differently. Some are marriage and divorce fees, birth certificate fees. You can see the whole list there, donations and funding, which gets to be a little sketchy. State line items where the state legislature will vote to put a small amount of money into a trust fund. Some use a combination of federal dollars and state dollars. For those of you who are not familiar with the trust fund, we depend on a $10 marriage license fee and then the $10 divorce complaint fee. We also, in the last few years, have been utilizing dollars that people can do as a checkoff when they apply for licenses and registration. So that has kept the trust fund alive, right? It hasn't really been any taxpayer dollars as such, and that generates a fairly significant amount of money for the trust fund to distribute in their grants. When we began, when we started, those of us who advocated for this wanted to make sure that there was a sustainable source of funding and that it couldn't be politicized, right? That it wouldn't be something that would get thrown into the middle of the mix, but that it was an item, a funding item that would occur really as a result of people getting married, divorced, and then later, as I said, came the registration for licenses and registrations for cars. So let me talk a little bit about the statutory requirements for the trust fund. The statute really lays out and articulates what the board composition and the terms should be, our revenue sources. The legislation talks about grant award process, how we give out grants, who's eligible for them. It requires a biennial state plan and an annual report. It also talks about the creation of a nonprofit supporting organization that was dissolved in 2020 when we realized, those board members at the time realized it just was not workable. And then, of course, as I mentioned earlier, a fairly good amount of staff support from the Department of Human Services, from Octel, from the legal office, from policy, from procurement, and from the Office of Children, Youth, and Families. So again, the Trust Fund Board could not operate without the full support of our friends and team members who are at the Office of Children, Youth, and Families, as well as Octel and the Center for Schools and Communities. I'll talk a little bit about the structure of the trust fund. The trust fund in the original legislation and to this day had 15 board members. Again, those of us who were there at the beginning wanted to make sure that it was a diverse and wide range of people from around the Commonwealth, and also to make sure that there was legislative participation and buy-in, quite honestly. We wanted to make sure that legislators, especially those who had a keen interest in children and youth issues, but those who were wanting to find ways to influence policy for family support, this was a way to do that. And there are 6 legislative members that are supposed to be on our board at any time. The Deputy Secretary for the Department of Human Services Office of Child Development and Early Learning serves as the Executive Director, which is obviously a different function than mine. But that office, again, very supportive of our work, and just up until yesterday was in communication with the deputy who wants to make sure that those of us who are kind of coming back to the trust fund or who are new to the trust fund have the support that we need. And we also have contracted staff who support the trust fund, not so much the board, but the grantees. And we're going to talk a little bit about that in a moment, because the critical thing to remember here is that we can give people all of the grants in the world, but if they don't have the right kind of support, technical assistance, capacity building, then they're not going to do the kind of job that we want them to do. And we want them to be successful. So that's the whole point of having the support from both Octel and from the Center for Schools and Communities. The next slide gives you a kind of more of a visual of how this works. The legislature and the governor appoint members. The governor appoints 9 of the members, the legislature 6. And then also on the right side of your screen, you can see the staff support for our work. Go on to the mission and the guiding principles. So I mentioned earlier that the trust fund, the legislation is a little dated, but again, still relevant. The board members that have preceded us kind of have continued to refine the mission and the guiding principles through the years. These are very close to the ones that we had established when I first started and on that original trust fund board, which is to influence public policy and to change social attitudes about child maltreatment. Not necessarily to focus just on what happens in the maltreatment issue, but how do we support families? How do we, as a community, go farther upstream to support families, all families that need kind of assistance or help at some point, right? So the idea is we want to use both those volunteer board members like myself, the grantees, as well as the legislature, to influence the thinking around child abuse prevention. And I think we've been pretty successful in doing that so far, but we have obviously always more work to do. Part of our mission is to initiate prevention programs that strengthen families, that build communities, and empower individuals. And I can't emphasize this one enough, is that the child abuse prevention, good, effective child abuse prevention, the research shows over and over that unless you work with the child, their family, and the community in which they live, the programs aren't going to be effective. And so if you would have an opportunity to look at what the trust fund has supported over the years, those are the kinds of efforts that are more encompassing, more inclusive of not only the child, but their family and the communities in which they reside. The grants are meant to encourage collaboration. We like to fund grants that can be replicated. We want to make sure that each of those grants locally is led by someone who's strong, capable, and has the support of their community. that they're flexible, and that they reflect the diversity of Pennsylvania, which is a highly diverse Commonwealth. We recognize that the responsibility as a trust fund board member, I myself, and all of the trust fund board members before me and the current ones understand that we're stewards of a fairly significant amount of money. And also that in giving a grant, we are entrusting a fairly significant amount of money into the hands of a community that has this kind of ultimate responsibility to make sure that kids are safe and that their families have the resources that they need. And then finally, we are all about ensuring, at the bottom line, is ensuring the safety of kids in Pennsylvania. So let's go on to this. So our statement reads that every child has the right to be safe, to be nurtured, protected from child abuse and neglect, to reach their full potential, and also to grow up in a supportive, stable family. This has been the focus of a lot of the grants over the last several years. If you look back, you'll see that the focus really has been, this energy has been around how do we keep families together? How do we support parents who are under stress, sometimes economic stress, sometimes social stress, sometimes psychological factors in the family. There could be a variety of factors that influence the family's well-being. The programs that the trust fund is supporting are meant to and designed to go farther upstream to make sure that the families have what they need. And in terms of reaching their full potential, not only the child, but the family's full potential. And we believe that every community has the right to be trusted and to make support and support it to make decisions about the appropriate services. So the trust fund doesn't try to prescribe who's going to get a grant or any of that. We really want to make sure that the grants that we give reflect the trust in a community or a neighborhood, and also reflect that belief in a very highly diverse Commonwealth, Pennsylvania. Rural counties, highly urbanized counties, and then everything in between, right? So it's not possible for us to come up with some kind of a formula or a menu that only serves Elk County or Schuylkill County or just Philadelphia County, right? We want to make sure that the grants reach a wide variety of people. And I think the trust fund has more work to do in that area. We're going to continue to keep refining that process, but to make sure that the grants reflect community and parent voice. And finally, in reflecting that diversity in Pennsylvania, we want to make sure that every community's culture is represented within the context of those grants. So just to kind of reiterate the Pennsylvania has a $10 surcharge on marriage and divorce applications. So we encourage people to get marriage, not divorced, but either way, we're going to get $10 from it, which is a good thing. And there is also investment income. There's a little bit of money that's generated that goes back into the trust fund from our investments. You can make donations through state income tax returns, which is for people who would like to add that little bit of money on, that's great. We encourage people to do that. And then a $5 donation through the Pennsylvania Department of Transportation online renewal services. And I don't know all the particulars of this, but I'm told by our friends at Octel that that has actually generated a fair amount of income over the last couple of years, a lot more than anybody had suspected would. And it's all deposited into a special non-lapsing state account. So the trust fund at any one point might have maybe a little under $2 million. So it's not a huge amount of money from, if it's we're talking about a foundation or, a large philanthropy. But certainly for the kinds of grant making we want to do, it works very nicely. Okay, let's go on to the next one. The trust fund board itself is led by a board chair. That's myself. My term is new, and then, as I mentioned, we have the assistance of Octel and DHS. We do a fair amount of information sharing. I would like to see the trust fund get into a position of being able to do some more messaging about supporting families across the Commonwealth. We do a fair amount of planning to make sure that we know the kinds of grant making that we want to do. We have to, as volunteers, we have to do our homework to make sure we understand that when applicant A or applicant B steps forward, that we've done our homework to make sure that they are serving the right population and that their applications reflect the voice of the community. All the minutes of the meetings, the quarterly meetings, we keep minutes of all of those. There is a board committee structure, although I think we're going to revisit some of that as we have new members come on. And the committee chairpersons will go on to schedule committee meetings, develop the agendas, and provide updates. So a lot of what we're doing right now, I think, will be to, as a group that's coming together, a lot of newbies on the group. How do we figure out the roles and responsibilities and give people a shared sense of ownership of the trust fund? Let's go on to the next slide. The trust fund board members actively participate in the grant process. I think we would, now that the trust fund board is starting to fill out again, as you probably know, there are a fair amount of vacancies, but as it begins to fill out, we want to make sure that board members are an active part of the grant-making process. Everything from helping to shape what the RFA looks like, our best thinking about, the philosophy and the belief, the philosophy and the belief of family support and prevention. And then also, we're expecting that everybody's going to actively participate in board meetings. The meeting we had recently was in person, but going forward, most of our meetings, as I understand it, are virtual. And, we'll see about whether it makes sense to bring people together in person. But for the most part, the virtual meetings seem to work well because we have folks all the way out in the western end, all the way into Philadelphia County. So that makes it a little bit challenging. Everyone who is a trust fund board member has to fill out the appropriate paperwork, make sure there's no conflicts of interest, make sure that we state any financial interest that we have, anything that could be Commonwealth related, and that has to be done annually by May 1st. And then all of the documentation, all of the paperwork that we complete needs to be notarized and submitted to the Secretary of the Commonwealth. So for people who are receiving a request for applications, people out there who are potential applicants for grants, one of the things that we tell them is that there are certain requirements for these grants, right? A match. So there's a match that jurisdictions have to provide. They don't get the money just simply by asking. It's a competitive bid process, obviously, but also for every grant that goes out, there is a match. And the match is, in some part, can be cash, some part can be in kind. But they're percentages, and it can't go below that. And this has been an issue that I think some of the grantees have fed us information back over the last few years in particular. The match sometimes can be difficult or challenging for some of the smaller organizations, especially those in smaller counties, right, where the resources aren't quite as deep. And so we have to, I think, look at that as a board and think about what is our best option to encourage those smaller entities and smaller organizations to apply, and see what we can do and recommend to either the legislature or to Octel about the match requirement. We want to make sure that the grants that we make are focused on primary and secondary prevention. We don't want to compete with other funding sources. We want to figure out how entities and organizations, agencies, counties, et cetera, make use of those other resources, but we're primarily interested in primary and secondary prevention. We want programs that work with the whole family, and we want to provide evidence that the program fits in the community. So we want to see something in those applications that tells us this type of a program, this type of a model, this approach, et cetera, has worked in other places. If it's in a rural county or an urban or suburban area, we want to make sure that there's some evidence or some information that tells us that this is an effective strategy and that it has a chance of working in, you name the county. We want to make sure that the trust fund applicant has coordinated their effort with the County Children and Youth Agency. It does not have to be approved by the County Children and Youth Agency, but we want them to at least inform them that this application is being made. And that was something I can tell you from my own history prior to even the legislation was passed. One of the most kind of contentious areas in discussion when that legislation was shaped in 1988 was what would be the role of the County Children and Youth Agency in the trust fund applicants document, right? And so we landed on the compromise that they at least had to cooperate or to coordinate with that County Children and Youth Agency. And that has remained to this day. And then finally, we wanted to make sure that all of the applicants pay some attention to the what are called the protective factors.
Paul,
Yes.
can you review the protective factors and then wrap up your remarks? I'm going to give members a few moments to ask
Absolutely.
some questions, and then I will guide the members that the rest of Paul's presentation is in the packet if you wanted to review that and ask that in your questions.
Absolutely. And let's go to the protective factors. So the protective factors is a very distinct and discrete model that was developed several years ago. It's not an approach, but it is a model, and it's aligned with science, with research, all about what families need to succeed. It doesn't work on weaknesses. It doesn't work on challenges. It doesn't work on blaming families. It works on this belief that if you can provide 5 factors, if you can see these factors reinforced through trust fund grants and other kinds of resources, parental resilience, social connections, the knowledge of parenting and child development, concrete supports like food, clothing, and shelter, and social emotional competence of the child. Those of you who have kids, have nephews, nieces, you know that these are the things that make families successful, right? It's not necessarily brain science, but it is important to figure out that if families are going to be successful, these are the things they need. So I'll stop there and take questions or comments, whatever.
Thank you, Paul. I really appreciate that.
Yeah.
I do recognize that we've been joined by a few members during your remarks, Representative Kazim out of Delaware County, Representative Powell out of Allegheny County, Representative Curry out of Delaware County, Representative Nelson out of Montgomery County, and Representative Howard out of Chester County. A few other members are joining us. I know Representative Zimmerman was here with guests and had to leave, and a few other folks had to get to other voting meetings. So I appreciate your patience and flexibility as we come and go to attend to some of our other responsibilities here in the Capitol. I would like to have the members ask any questions if they have any. Representative Serrato.
Thank you so much for coming today, and thank you for your work on this very important topic. As a child that came from an abusive background and household, it's really important that we try and prevent these so that other children don't experience that in the future. I'm wondering, when I look at these factors and frameworks, where does mental health come to play? Because I think that is a huge factor in abuse, is the parental mental health and also the mental health and well-being of the child. Is that kind of factored in some way with the social emotional competence? But I think, how do we reach out and get those families? Is that done through the grant program?
It's a significant contributor to maltreatment issues, for sure. And if you look at the numbers across the country and in Pennsylvania, parental mental health issues, parental substance use and abuse issues are also high on the list of causal factors. So much of the programming that's done through the trust fund grants will address those issues. Frequently, though, that's more likely to come to light after the fact, which is unfortunate. But I do think that the trust fund grantees, a number of them pay close attention to those issues related to how do we keep kids safe in homes where a parent might have a mental health issue or might have a substance use issue. Kids don't necessarily have to be removed, shouldn't be removed from everything, right? We want to keep families intact, but that plays an important role. Absolutely.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Representative Serrato. And I just wanted to share with the members that the legislative appointees from the House include myself, Representative Flood, and most newly appointed member, Representative Powell, who will be joining us. And she has a question. Representative Powell?
Thank you so much, Chairwoman. Thank you so much for being here and sharing about this critical work. I had a question about the requirements to apply for grants. As you said, making sure that folks have, that we're able to mitigate any barriers that folks doing good work on the ground, trying to make sure that we're able to create a system that everyone is able to apply for. I had a question about the matching aspect of it. When you're talking about organizations that are able to apply, does the match include cash collateral? Does it include just having money in the bank? Are there other assets that people can leverage to ensure that they're able to be eligible for this type of funding?
There has to be thank you for the question. There has to be a combination. Congratulations, too, on your appointment to the board. The match has to be a combination. It can be a combination of cash that they have to be able to provide themselves, and then it could be in-kind staff help, staff support, et cetera. So it can be a combination. I think one of the things that looks to be happening, and again, I was off the board for many years and now I've come back, but in the time since then, it looks as if some of the smaller organizations do have a struggle meeting that match. And I mention that because one of the original purposes of the trust fund was to make sure that more community, neighborhood-based organizations had a chance to step up and say, look, we're doing something kind of interesting here. It doesn't always have to be evidence-based, but there has to be some way for us to show that it's going to be effective. Nonetheless, sometimes it's those smaller, under-the-radar groups that are doing something that could be really helpful and meaningful in the life of a family. So I'd like to think that one of my roles as chair, working alongside all the great new board members we have, is that we can figure out how do we nurture the applications from those smaller organizations and also ensure that those creative, innovative approaches see the light of day. When we were at our recent planning meeting, I used the analogy of Shark Tank, on TV, where you see people come in front of and they say, we have an idea here. We've been trying it out. We've started to get some sales, but we need someone to jump in, someone who's willing to invest. And I'd like to think that we can inspire innovation, entrepreneurialism, but mostly just neighborhood and community-based approaches to how you support families in their own homes and in their own communities.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Representative Powell. Representative Nelson, followed by Representative Curry.
Thank you so much. Can you talk a little bit? I appreciate the work and the challenge of trying to provide a safe environment for all children. I am myself just a small bit biased towards real partnerships and collaborations with our school systems.
Yes.
Particularly when I think about the school systems and their wide breadth of exposure to our youth versus our county children and youth organizations that I would argue are providing critical resources, but they're kind of chasing a tail. How do you guys think about your grantees as trying to get ahead of that curve and working in a proactive nature as opposed to providing grants to organizations that are providing a much needed service to those who are already going through something?
I think, thank you for that question. I think that myself, the new board members in particular, will have to spend some time with that because I happen to believe you're right on target with this. Kids show up in schools, kids show up in medical facilities and in front of doctors and nurses and others, and law enforcement, right? Those are the places that we want to be able to reach so that if a family can get support and help prior to anybody ever calling the Office of children and youth, or whatever it is in your particular county, that those resources are part of a collaborative, part of a partnership that is going on, right? We should be entertaining proposals and looking for proposals that are school attached or school aligned, maybe attached with medical facilities, maybe a clinic, maybe a law enforcement that wants to do something more for families in their community, doesn't want to take a strict law enforcement approach, but wants to do an alternative to that. So I think applications that come to us, the better they would be. And I think generally this is what the trust fund has done. The better chances they have are attached to those that evidence of collaboration and cooperation with other resources and other agencies, organizations.
Rep. Curry?
Thank you, Chair. I have really been focusing on the 5 protective factors that are up on the screen. Really important space. I just want to name the social determinants of health, and I would encourage the board members, the newer board members, and yourself to really focus on those areas in your framework, because what we know is happening and what some of the other members here have been talking about is, really, I see up there social connections. Those are really important. And when you talk about children showing up, schools, health care providers, and the police, law enforcement, we want to make sure that all of those spaces are considered, especially because a lot of the grassroots folks that are on the ground doing the work every day, they deal with food insecurity, housing insecurity, and all the things that we know when it comes down to this framework that I think the language should absolutely include, and being inclusive of all when we're doing this work. So I just wanted to make that comment that, looking at the protective frameworks and the factor in the framework really should include the language of social determinants of health.
So I'm too old and it will look too silly for me to get up and do the happy dance, but I totally agree with you, mainly because my current job, I mentioned in my intro, I'm the executive director of a foundation, and we base all our work on the social determinants of health. And I'm really a firm believer that the next evolution of child welfare, whether it's in Pennsylvania or wherever else, really has to be even more of a public health approach, right? We can't expect families who are under constant pressure, economic pressure, social pressure, psychological pressure, all of those things, to be able to adequately parent their children, right? I mean, all these things contribute to the health and well-being of a family. And you can't divorce the child from their family. They don't just kind of operate on their own. So we need that full support. The social determinants of health, I think, are parallel to this. They really are very consistent. But I would ask all of you who are looking at the screen right now, think about your own lives. Think about why you're sitting here today. You're sitting here today because of some of these factors, right? As some adult in your life, whether it was your parent or a grandparent or an aunt or whoever it was that raised you, I mean, these were some of the things that were probably present in your home. And if they weren't, there was another adult who helped supplement them. So, I really do believe we have an opportunity to impact what happens in communities and what happens in neighborhoods across the Commonwealth. But we can't wait until families show up at the doorstep of the Children and Youth Agency. Going back to Representative Nelson's point, using those partnerships as a way to go farther upstream.
Thank you, Rep. Curry. Paul, as you mentioned, if we looked at our own lives and thought about these factors, and I saw that first one, parental resilience, and I could just think any of us probably had an auntie or a mom or dad or a grandparent that made a way out of no way and found a way to support us, rob Peter to pay Paul to make sure the lights were on, and some of these other factors, a lot of things just came through my head as you said that. So, and Rep. Curry, I do think that Paul is correct that there are some parallels, maybe not the same language, but within there, the spirit of social determinants of health are there. I also note that there's a TM trademark, so at the top of that line, and at the bottom, you'll see that we've adopted these principles from the Center for Study of Social Policy, which you can go to their website and find more detail about how they came up with these particular 5 protective factors.
Yeah, I want to just mention something here, kind of on a personal note. Before my father passed away several years ago, I remember talking with him about, because my parents never quite understood what I did. They just thought I was a grown-up Boy Scout. And so when I sat with my dad one day and I just said, I want you to think about this stuff, the 5 factors here. We started talking about them, and we could talk about each one. Like, he gave examples of what that meant for us as kids, and it was really, it's very common sense, right? We know that the parents, that the parental resilience, right? The fact that the parents get up every day, they go to work, they do their thing, whatever it is that they are doing to keep that household together, right? And families come in a variety of different shapes and sizes and alternatives. We know that as well. But the point is that there's some parent there who's driving that every day. And the social connections, the network of people that you have in your neighborhood. I lived in the city of Philadelphia, and so there was always somebody outside. Somebody on the front stoop or outside in our neighborhood walking around. And my parents' house was always filled with people on Sundays. So we had all those things that are considered to be the 5 protective factors. They never called it that, but that's what happened, right? And so I would ask you, in your work, supporting the trust fund, supporting any of the work that you do around prevention, that you think about these 5 factors and you think about how do we kind of apply that common sense framework to what we're trying to accomplish here. And the kids don't operate in a vacuum. They function within a family and in a community.
Thank you. I'll leave the remaining questions and closing questions to my chair, Chair Joswiak. Would you have some final questions and comments?
Yes. Real briefly, I see you've worked with the Department of Human Services. Have you collaborated with the Department of Health at all?
Well, it's been a number of years since I worked at DHS. I worked when it was the Ridge administration, so it goes back a ways. We did cooperate with the Department of Health and with the Department of Education. And I, in particular, had the responsibility while I was in state government. I had several responsibilities, but one of them was to develop a network of family centers across the state, family resource centers that are still standing in a number of places. And those we did in cooperation with the Health Department, with the Department of Education, and some others as well.
Yeah, the other question I had was the board vacancies. What creates them? I mean, is there term limits, or people just say, had enough of this?
Term limits,
There was term limits.
and then there was no appointments made for a
How
long
many
period of time.
vacancies do you have right now?
I'm not sure, to be honest with you. I think all of the governor appointees have been made.
Well, I'll just wrap up if I can make a
I just
comment.
wanted to clarify, do we still have the 2 Senate
I think
vacancies?
we're still waiting for the 2 Senate ones, too.
So I was, Mr. DiLorenzo, I learned a lot here today. There's a lot here I did not know about. I learned about the trust fund. I learned about your mission. I learned about how you get your income and also how you handle your grants. And for me, this was very, very good information because I did not know this.
Yeah.
So I just want to say thank you for being here. And I'm glad I sat here and listened to all this.
Thank you.
very
Appreciate
much.
that. Thanks. I'm glad it was helpful.
Thank you, Chair Joswiak. And I somewhat echo Chair Joswiak's comments in that I didn't know much about the Children's Trust Fund until I was appointed to the Children's Trust Fund in my role as the majority chair of this committee. And when we had an opportunity to have our retreat last week or 2 weeks ago, I said, we must share this information with my colleagues because it's important that we understand that what the work of this trust fund is. It is established by statute. There may be an opportunity in the future to review that language and how we can bring the Children's Trust Fund up to date. This was it was created more than 30 years ago, and And so we want to make sure that the trust fund is meeting the needs of Pennsylvania's families and children today. And so as we continue to do the work that we do here in this committee, we look forward to partnering with the Children's Trust Fund to support the work that the fund is doing, but also to help the fund reimagine itself for the Pennsylvania's children today, so we can continue to do the good work and remain true to the spirit of the mission. As you mentioned, even over the 30 plus years, when you looked at the current wording of the priorities and mission of the board, it was very much similar to where we were when you first joined and advocated for this board, that we still keep Pennsylvania's children as the priority of this board. So thank you so much for that work. Thank you for your testimony today and for sharing this hour with us. And we look forward to our continued partnership.
I so appreciate the time. Thank you so much for inviting me.
Thank you. Our informational meeting for today is adjourned.